Hi everyone, the name is Nat, and welcome to our Thursday webinar series where we deliver engaging content to better understand your noggin. This week we are taking a deep dive into classic autism. Classic isn't the legit name. Infantile autism, Kanner's autism, Kanner syndrome, there's loads of different names it goes by, is out of date. However, people still use it. The past greatly informs the future. Hence why we are going back in time a little and looking at a diagnosis which has been incredibly influential and arguably still very influential, and maybe not always in the most positive ways. History is a messy thing. Today, we are purely focusing on autism. Normally, we talk about how things interlink and how you cannot separate one from the other. Yet today, that isn't quite the case because this is very much isolated, or at least was believed to be isolated. That said, we are going to talk a little bit about schizophrenia, classic autism, a history. We have definitely done the history of autism before, but today we're doing a much narrower focus. We're looking at a particular slice of the autism pie. That is looking at this bloke, Kanner. Interesting guy. While is often cited as American, he's not actually. He came from a place that no longer exists. Technically, I don't know technically is the right word. I guess you could say Ukrainian, because he's in a place now which is Ukraine. But at the time, it was Austrian-Hungaria, no man's land now. But it's interesting that all our most famous psychologists, child physicians, all of that stuff, often came from Austria. It was like the capital of the world. Another famous Austrian was Hans Asperger, well known for autism. These two never actually met. By this point, Kanner was in America doing research at Johns Hopkins University. He also studied in Berlin, so he's been a very busy guy. The reason we're talking about Kanner is he is the father of children's psychiatry. He did a lot of work in autism, though that wasn't his sole focus. His version of autism, or at least what he observed, was social struggles, repetitive behavior, and sensory sensitivities. So a triad. We'll go on and we'll realize that this has been tweaked and changed over time. He didn't call it classic autism because it wasn't classic at that time. It was infantile autism. He saw it in children, and to put it a bit more exact, they were all male, and they used to be seen as a form of infantile psychosis or schizophrenia. And yeah, that was wrong. He was moving away from that. The key thing now is today, we don't call it classic autism as it's integrated into ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. That was only 2013, and people take a long time to get up to date. This is still relevant, even though it's not current. We will have a look at what name you know it by. Autism, I think it's a lot like Batman. Batman, The Dark Knight, The Crypt Crusader, The World's Greatest Detective, Bruce Wayne. Depending what you call it, has many different names. However, these names have different connotations. Infantile autism, what it was OG known as. That was what Kanner, whatever, called it. However, it's factually incorrect because we know autism isn't just for young people. It is predominantly diagnosed around 2 or 3. Autistic Disorder, that is the name that came up just before our revision in 2013. Childhood autism is saying the same thing as infantile autism, just maybe it's a bit more of a well understood name. Kanner syndrome is crediting the main man himself, but he wasn't the only person working on autism, so maybe it's giving him a little bit too much credit. Classic autism is what we know it as now, Autism Spectrum Disorder. This is by far the best name within this list. The reason for that is it talks about a spectrum. Autism does not fit neatly into a box. To have autism spectrum disorder, you don't have to be a child. You don't have to have intellectual difficulties. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to have just repetitive behaviors. You don't have to be just male. It's much more inclusive. It means more people are able to gain support. Emma says she's a classic at 42. Vintage. Looking at a more modern way of talking about autism, I want you to put a little pin on your preferred way of talking about it. This is 2025, so which way would you feel most comfortable having autism spoken about? Do you say, oh yeah, I live with autism? Do you say, I suffer from autism? Are you on the spectrum? Are you a person with autism, or are you autistic? These different ways are not used as a clinical label. They are used more colloquially when we're just talking in a general way. Living with autism? Autism ain't paying rent. It doesn't get to say it lives with me. Suffer with autism? Autism can be difficult, but it's not like a throbbing heartburn. On the spectrum? Sounds like you're surfing to me. I personally don't mind the word spectrum, but I think some people are having a complicated relation with it because it's been used willy-nilly and has devalued it. A person with autism, essentially saying, hey, I got autism, it's a bit more distancing. This is much more used by clinical professionals. Yet individuals with autism, more often than not, will say they are autistic because they are inherently who they are. Mina says, I put the person before the condition. Saying you suffer is probably not right. In terms of the other last three, I think they're fine. Someone said it's nothing, maybe a different term. I feel like people say they're on the spectrum is derogatory way, unfortunately. Esme, I'm torn about my views. I think it can be fine, but I do think it is unfortunately used as a bit of a slur sometimes. If we go to 1967, how was autism defined? Autism thinking was a term used to talk about people with autistic kind of characteristics. And I'll be honest with you, it wasn't the most flattering. Bellingham isn't my favourite guy in history. Did he think that autistic thinking was escaping into fantasy, an ND condition, unmet wishes, or poor parenting? Either way, none of them are sounding overly positive. Escaping into fantasy. He thought we had our heads in the clouds. I'm a daydreamer. I'm not the only one, said someone. John Lennon. It's clearly not an ND condition because people didn't really get it was neurodevelopmental. Unmet infantile wishes, how some described it, definitely wasn't an official way of thinking about it. Canna, interestingly, did make parallels between poor parenting and autism, though observational rather than any kind of concrete parenting factors, as we heard about the refrigerator mother in the past. Essentially, if you didn't love your child enough, but that was all hearsay. There's many different ways of how other people defined it, and there wasn't no set official way. Being in our own world. Some people say escaping into fantasy could be negative, but the imagery it creates in some ways. Where are we today? We have come a long way. We used to talk about autism as a triad. Now we're talking about a dyad. That just means it isn't what made autism has disappeared, but I think we have consolidated and made the criteria more broad as we learned more about autism. When you look at the statistics, no one has autism. Everyone has autism. There's an epidemic. We have just changed our understanding of autism throughout time. So it's not surprising that as more awareness has been growing and the definition has widened, that naturally there is going to be more people that fit into that bracket. Simply, if you have a diagnosis, you are more likely to get help. If you struggle with social communication and you have repetitive behavior and certain sensory sensitivities, you probably are on the spectrum, as they would say. Whether or not you get a diagnosis depends on whether or not your autistic thinking, as it would have been known as, is interfering with your day-to-day life. Let's say you struggle a little bit with communication and you have some sensory sensitivities, but honestly, it's not really bothering you. You're doing fine in life. Then you wouldn't need a diagnosis. But you can have autism and not have ASD. If you have ASD, you'll be autistic. Some people resonate with being autistic, even though they aren't diagnosed. I would argue that is just as merited, but those with official diagnosis have been a stamp of approval that this person genuinely could benefit from support, and there are barriers in day-to-day life that is interfering with them living their best life. On the spectrum can include more neurodivergent aspects than only autism, doesn't it? Kinda. When people referred to it, I'd say 9 times out of 10, they're referring to autism. But as co-occurrence has grown in understanding, more people are using the term more widely. Originally, neurodivergence was purely autism, then dyslexia, then ADHD. Now, any alternative way of thinking could be neurodivergent. And I would say a similar thing is happening with spectrum. Going back to the 40s, and this is where it was all kicking off, and where Kahner actually defined autism. He was looking at early social and behavioral challenges. The key thing here is early. As I already mentioned, he's American at this point because he has fully settled himself down in America and thriving. His exact words were extreme self-isolation. That kind of makes sense to the word autism. The origins of the word is alone and self-isolating. An obsessive insistence on sameness. The reason he got to this observation was he had lots of different case examples where he would look at how they would act, how they would maneuver themselves around life, and he saw consistent patterns. He didn't see them get worse, which you would typically expect in schizophrenia. You also didn't notice any intellectual disabilities in a lot of them. Some of them were very intelligent. These were all things he was picking up. At the same time, he was doing his research. There was also research happening the other side of the world. What relates to your neurodivergence? Do you find your characteristics were quite early onset? Did you have any social withdrawal? Were there any impaired communication? Repetitive behaviors? Intense interests? Cognitive variabilities? Limited emotional attachments? Or did you not have schizophrenia? According to Kahner, you'd be a very prime candidate to have autism or infantile autism. Only one person has early onset, so you're the only person who would actually qualify for classic autism. Social with communication, repetitive behavior, those who selected these ones, you would probably be considered for ASD today. Intense interests, while that is a common thing with autism, you can have interests and not be autistic. It's not an intellectual disability. It's wide and varied. Limited emotional attachment is outdated. People thought that it was like a lonely condition where you were intentionally isolating. It's true that autistic people do have less friends on average than those who are not autistic, but it's not for a lack of wanting friends. It's through difficulties with that kind of emotional connection. Again, schizophrenia would have to be ruled out first, where autism tends to stay consistent and can't be cured. In a newspaper article, Kahner identified infantile autism-schizophrenia. He didn't think it was schizophrenia. It was just a way to explain it. Let's look at Mr. Hans. Hans Asperger is a well-known name in the autism community because the condition was named after him. He didn't name it. He wasn't that big-headed. He just called it autism. It was later on that it was named after him. They both originated from a similar place in the world, but had no knowledge of each other, or particularly Kahner didn't have knowledge of Hans Asperger's. Whether that's true or not, maybe we'll never know. It's debated. They were both doing similar research. Hans' research was aimed at individuals with high intelligence and social challenges, similar to Kahner's autism, but not related to delays in every area. Some people were doing very well in certain places. They might still be more isolating and reclusive, but it wouldn't hamper their interests. This is a controversial bloke, and we talked about this in many other different webinars we've done, but was he a Nazi? No. Did he comply? Yes. While some of these politicians do not directly have blood on their hands, you can't say they're innocent by any means. This is why we moved away from Hans Asperger. Just like Kahner's autism, it was flawed. It was too limiting. It focused on some narrow aspects of autism and circled it as its own distinct condition, but probably was too narrow and it limited people from gaining help. In his main research,
the Autistischen Psycopathen,
this lovely documentation that he created, which apparently Kana never read. But again, I'm not sure if we believe that. He wrote this lovely thing. I want you all to read and tell me the key message. This research was done in the 40s, and it took 30 years before it started to actually be read by people of the English language. And this is where some people considered Kana's research as the original research, because his was the first English time that autism was spoken about in a very public way. It is called Autistic People, Psychopaths, which is incorrect. Cannot be understood. It is around high intelligence, social challenges, and distinct from Kana's autism. Overlaps, but interesting research done in parallel, apparently without each other's understanding. One thing they focused on was how it differed it from schizophrenia. People thought, it's schizophrenia. There were a few things that, from the studies to what we know about schizophrenia, they weren't adding up. First of all, starts in late adolescence. Yep, schizophrenia. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, and its typical onset, so when it presents itself, is around 2 or 3. Schizophrenia is later, maybe early puberty. Social and behavioral challenges. Yes, predominantly autism. While schizophrenia, of course, could be social and behavioral challenges, they aren't an integral part of it. Worsen. Can it get worse? Schizophrenia can get worse. Autism doesn't. Take that with a pinch of salt though, because while autism doesn't get worse, it can fluctuate throughout your life. When you are stressed, it can get worse in terms of how you manage it, but autism itself does not. How you respond to the world can be more challenging. It's the same. We've got varied intellectual abilities. Those with autism or classic autism have varied intellectual abilities. That is, I think, a really important thing. There are a lot of people with autism who do have intellectual challenges. That is true. But there are also a lot of people with autism who have no intellectual challenges. That's why it can be something which is used as a way of understanding it, particularly classic autism. We're not talking about today's understanding of autism. I'm sure there are people with schizophrenia like that. You'll get one little dot again, and I want you to put a dot on a autism symptom. I'm not going to tell you which one's which, but some are autism, some are not. You might see why people were confused. How could you get autism confused with schizophrenia? There are overlaps. It was only people looking at the fringes of one or the other is where they started seeing the key differences. Sam says, I think autism gets worse with age because you don't have the same energy to filter the world. I see what you're saying, Sam. I would say it's not like a disease. Let's say cancer. Cancer can get worse. Autism doesn't get worse, but how you manage it does. So what you're saying is right. Whatever autism is, whatever autism gene, whatever makes autism, that doesn't get worse. But everything else around you gets worse. So like your energy might get worse, which might make it more difficult to manage your autism. On the left circle, that's schizophrenia. On the right circle, that is autism. In the middle is where there's a lot of overlap. If you had autism and you showed dissociations, executive function difficulties, social withdrawal, depression or anxiety, self-harm, like all of these things, a lot of people are like, that's schizophrenia right there. People with schizophrenia often went to asylums or mental institutions. Unfortunately, that's still happening today. Those with autism didn't need any of that stuff. They didn't need to be heavily medicated. But things that are purely autism and not schizophrenia was repetitive behavior. That wasn't part of schizophrenia. Echolalia is when you go out loud randomly, or you like mimicking things, or you like quotes. An example of this is that I believe Kana was doing some research with an autistic child, and they were non-verbal, and yet they eventually started to talk. I think they said something like good night. But when they eventually learned to talk, their words weren't attached to the meaning. They were just random words. So it's a bit like a parrot, where the parrot doesn't understand what is being said. It is just saying it because it likes to say it, or at least that's the idea. However, how do we truly know what someone understands or doesn't understand unless we are able to communicate with them? Carsten says, Don't you think this depends on how supporting one's social contexts are? In my opinion, autistic people can get old in a soluogenic way, in that their social contexts are stable and supporting. Interesting perspective. Oh, Sam says auditory hallucinations are both right. I love my auditory hallucinations. Hallucinations are nice when they're on your terms. April says my brother is nonverbal, which is why he could resonate with Kana. Again, with a lot of a form of autism, not so much nonverbal. I use echolalia as communication sometimes. While there are overlap, it's not the same. Oh, look at this babe, Lorna Wing. Lorna has done so much for the world of autism. They are the one who actually coined the term Asperger syndrome, because they finally went through, that document I showed you earlier on, and you're like, can't read it. She translated it. It was like someone else translated it, but she used that translation to go, this hasn't been documented in English speaking world. This isn't Kana's autism. This is some other type of autism. They named it in homage to Asperger. At this time, she didn't know any about his complicated history, by the way. She wasn't some secret person. She just didn't know. None of us knew until relatively recent. But their form of autism was predominantly related to social isolation and unique cognition. Unique cognition isn't about intellectual disability or ability just diverging from the norm, which is much more similar to today's understanding of autism. It is very distinct from classic autism, which was much more deficit-focused, was more aimed at adolescence, not so much around social isolation. So this is more progressive. Does autism impact intellectual abilities, or does autism impact people despite intellectual ability, which is why there's a range? Yes, it doesn't. You can have autism and have an intellectual disability, but you can have autism and not have an intellectual disability. It doesn't have to be one of the same. Autism is not one thing. It's many common gene variations. When you think of a range, people normally think linear, like A to B. That's not autism. It's not like severity levels. It's more three-dimensional. Some things are high, some are low. The extremes can fluctuate depending on your day in life. This is correct, but don't think of it in a linear way. Here is the actual translation we looked at earlier, done by Firth in 1991. This is a modern translation. Finally, people can actually learn their work. Let's have a little read. In what follows, I will describe a particularly interesting and highly recognizable type of child. The children I will present all have in common a fundamental disturbance which manifests itself in their physical appearance. Bear in mind, they found autistic people had bigger heads, very minor, but the finding. The disturbance results in severe difficulties of social integration. In many cases, the social problems are so profound, they overshadow everything else. What that is saying here is that, yes, we're all different, we're all unique, we all have our quirks, but these quirks are so severe that they interfere with day-to-day life, which is why you would get a diagnosis. In some cases, the problems are compensated by original thought and experience. People think when we talk about the strengths or the abilities of autistic or neurodivergent people, this is some kind of woke modern way of making us feel better. No, this is the original definition of autism. It has always been a thing. Yes, autism does equal original thought. This can often lead to exceptional achievements in later life. Bear in mind, this was 1944, so research was known about how valuable autism can be to society. Exceptional human beings must be given exceptional education treatments. I won't read the rest of it, but you can just see how progressive this was, and it took 30 years before the vast majority of people were able to read this and realize that we've known this longer than previously thought. Let's catch up to modern time now. After Wing started doing their research, looking at different translations, finally, classic autism is actually added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That was in the 3rd edition, so it took quite a while before it was actually in there. What made this particularly groundbreaking is now it is recognized as neurodevelopmental. It forms early on, but it can be with you throughout life. This isn't just something which is observed. There is actually something different with how the brain wires. This was a big step in the right direction. Since then, we have had many different models. We talk about Wing, we talk about Kana. They are just some forms of autism that we have adopted over the time. Other ones include Gilbert, Shazmeri, ICD, and DSM. They all have impaired social functioning at their core, but for some, we've got motor clumsiness as a form of autism, social isolation. Those parts of autism aren't part of the categories that most people use, particularly medical professionals. Long story short, autism is evolving, and not everyone agrees on what it is and what it isn't. Bear in mind, our understanding very well could be different in a few years' time. 2013 was pivotal for autism because we had different ways of categorizing people. We're like, oh God, this is confusing. Also, these are limiting because you might have had autistic disorder, classic autism, Asperger's syndrome, but if you're in the middle, you wouldn't meet the criteria for support. They consolidated it and squished it into ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. The ICD, the International Classification of Disorders, the one that predominantly is used in the UK and Europe, that did go with ASD, but that took a few years later. That followed suit. In this regard, the DSM was ahead of the curve. These days, it's probably lacking. They thought, okay, let's change this up. Before we had autism spectrum as an umbrella, but now we get rid of the bottom parts because everyone has that definition. In some ways, it made things harder to help people, but in other ways, it made it easier because more people were able to get help. Autism is actually different in terms of how we classify it, depending on what diagnostic manual you use. If you use the ICD, ASD is what you get. If you use the DSM, you use levels. I always thought using levels wasn't great because it creates a hierarchy. You're essentially repeating the mistakes of the past. Also, it makes you sound like a video game. On the other hand, though, having levels does make it easier as an external person to support you. If you said, oh, I have level 3 autism, that would be your classic autism or Kana's autism. This is someone who requires substantial help, who may have intellectual difficulties, but they also may not. If you look at someone who would have been known as Asperger's autism, they might have level 1 autism, where they essentially can mask it and no one would know they have autism, but they still do. The level system doesn't account for fluctuating. That's why I would say, do not use levels. We're not a Mario game. The reason we're doing today is because classic autism is still used. I want to know why we still use outdated terms. Why do we still use infantile autism or classic autism or Kana's autism or Asperger's syndrome? Leo says, is it really a good idea to merge everything as a DSM-5 did? Do you know what, Leo? That is a question. I would say it's not perfect. Do we have a better way? No. We went from a load of things to one thing to rule them all. I think the next revision of our manuals hopefully will do quite a drastic rebrand. Because of that, I think it'll be a few years before a proper update. Personal choice, I just prefer to use the classic term. Clinically known, for instance, clinicians normally take longer time to update everything. For example, in the UK, while the ICD-11 is currently in full swing, the NHS still predominantly uses the ICD-10, though people are able to go up to the next level, the next volume, whenever they choose. But it takes time for adoption. History, those previous conditions have been around much longer, so it's ingrained in people's psyches. Impact, I would argue that our prior understanding of autism has more impact. Legal and educational, the most up-to-date definition would be more apparent for this. As you can see by this lovely little diagram, this is the amount of publications that talk about autism, and we have been rising dramatically. Classic autism or Kana's autism is still very much cited and used. I like to end this on a look into the future. Where could we be going? ASD merge fuels classification debate. We are definitely not fixed on ASD. Social communication disorder has concerns because some people don't have communication disorders but do have challenges or strengths in other areas. Autism or ASD could be split up yet again. There's also differences, like maybe we should call it ASC, autism spectrum condition, rather than disorder, as we move away from a more clinical, deficit-focused view to a strength-based, neutral perspective. Now for a quick quiz, just to make sure you were listening. Who first described classic autism? Leo, Eugene, Hans, or Lorna? Yes, everyone, it is Leo. Leo was the first to describe classic autism. The key word here is classic autism. He used the term infantile autism. Number 2. Core trait of classic autism. What do you need in order to get the communication and repetitive behavior difficulties? A sudden social withdrawal, disinterest in routines. We're looking at core traits. Yes. Social communication and repetitive behavior is by far the essential traits. Others could be part of it. First recognized as infantile autism in what manual? I've got to remember all my Rocky movies now. Is that 4? Yeah, 4, 10, 3, or 5. Yes, it was number 3. Before then, didn't exist. Later, we updated it. I think it was just autism disorder in number 4 and ASD in number 5. Classic onset is linked to what? Is it adolescence onset, present from birth, aged after 10, or adult onset? What do you need to have classic autism? Onset means when it develops, by the way, or presents itself. Yes, present from birth. Maybe, depending when you define adolescence, it could be. Because I think it's not about when you've had autism, because autism is for life, but onset is when it presents itself. After age 10, typically an adult onset, no. That's not to say you can't have it as an adult, but that's not when it typically presents itself or becomes known. The last question, how is classic autism classified in DSM? Is it a separate diagnosis? Is it part of ASD? Or is it a cognitive disability? Oh, yes, 100%. Yes, it is part of a spectrum, so much broader. It is not a cognitive disability. It is not a type of schizophrenia, and it is not a separate form. It's just one form. Classic autism was first identified in the early 40s. There is a debate on its uniqueness. Where do we draw the line with autism? In the DSM-III, it was merged in 2013, so we now have one label to rule them all. The classification is still very much in flux. I'm almost certain that give us 10, 15 years, we may even have a new name for it. If you want to see this later or check our other ones, you can always subscribe. Go to our YouTube channel. We are so close to getting to 10,000. I really want that 10K by the end of the year. So click subscribe, ring the bell, and contact us should you wish to find out any more information. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Go outside, enjoy nature,